The meta within Honkai style is ever-changing. The game has 3 rotating endgame modes that frequently change the playing field with every cycle. Even though the overall experience is the same, depending on the iteration's gimmick, one archetype of units may be stronger than another. As a turn-based game, full completion of said mode usually boils down to numbers, a yes or no question. Do you have the right amount of damage and/or the right units to complete that cycle or not? The constant mini fluctuations in value within the roster can be a positive or negative thing depending on who you ask. On one hand, players have the opportunity to try out a variety of characters, subsequently allowing for a huge portion of the roster to find relevant use. But on the other hand, it can also be stressful and financially straining to keep up with the growing demand for units. No matter what camp you find yourself in, being a gacha game and therefore costing a pretty penny to max out your collection, objectively, the endgame of HSR does have a high price point, which only makes units like Acheron all the more essential to have. Ever since her debut in version 2.1, Acheron is arguably the most popular damage dealer in the game, having a consistent, if not almost obligatory presence across Memory of Chaos, Pure Fiction, and the new Apocalyptic Shadow. Remarkably, while other characters have oscillated between popular and obscure, Acheron has pretty much never fallen off in relevance even a little bit. For today's episode of Why Everyone Plays, we'll detail the Nihility Emanator's career so far, and how she likely won't run out of steam anytime soon. Acheron's success has every bit to do with the environment she came into, as it does her own capability. For most people, the reasons are self-evident, but I think it's also a matter of timing that contributed towards her popularity. For example, characters like Himeko didn't really find lasting gainful employment until just recently, while Acheron's value was acknowledged from the very get-go and has only matured over time. Version 2 was a huge commercial success for the game. Granted, Honkai Star Rail was doing pretty well before, but the amount of effort put into the game's marketing, advertisements, production, and such was decidedly elevated as we entered the second year of the game. Panenkoni's scale certainly felt a lot more grand in comparison to Urilla 6 and the Shinjo, although in fairness, the latter's story is still technically incomplete. Essentially, attention focused on the game was at an all-time high around this time, leading up perfectly to Acheron's release. On top of having the backing of Honkai Impact 3's player base being an alternate version of Raiden Mei, she was the intersecting point for many of the connected parts of the Panenkoni storyline, making her an extremely prominent character who will no doubt continue to be involved in the future. And, lest we forget, many of us got to witness a fraction of her power on full display, lending further credence to her appeal. Gameplay-wise, around this time, Honkai Star Rail took a measurable leap in difficulty. While the game has been progressively getting harder and harder, with enemies having more HP and new mechanics and whatnot being introduced, Pure Fiction's release in 1.6 added a new layer of content we had to go through, not to mention Swarm Disaster's Golden Gears expansion taking place around the same time. Compared to what we had to experience early on, version 2 accelerated the metagame of HSR, and at this point, optimization and efficiency became paramount. In other words, serious players had to start getting, serious. The influx of new enemy types, new mechanics, and new game modes made coverage the first and foremost priority. But with how different Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction were in design, constructing parties that were suitable for both was pretty difficult. Usually a team that excelled at one mode was inefficient if not lackluster in another, the one exception at the time being the newly minted Kafka Swan team, capable of taking on both game modes to great effect. But there was still another party that needed to be formed, and while you could always just default to her to Himeko for PF and whatever MLC teams you already had built up, the need for universal coverage was fresh on everyone's mind, perfect timing for Acheron's release. The most defining aspect of Acheron, and part of what made her so popular, is that they really captured the essence of Nihility not giving a literal f about anything when making her kit. Whether by coincidence or not, being the emanator of non-existence itself gave her the ability to effectively not care about who or what you were fighting, the conditions in which you were fighting, and so on. It's unanimously agreed upon that Acheron was the most significant leap in power yet, so much so that you'd be hard-pressed to find a legitimate shortcoming within her kit that cannot be overcome. Though a member of the Nihility path, Acheron is widely regarded as a general attacker and typer carry, with the central playstyle revolving around applying debuffs to enemies. Instead of a standard energy cost, Acheron's ultimate is activated upon reaching 9 charges over town. How this works to her benefit is that battery through debuff application is magnitudes more abundant than battery through energy. Right now, the only characters who can juice up another ally's ultimate would be Hoho and Tingyun, whereas any status effect of any kind, damage over time, stat reduction, crowd control, literally anything that induces a status effect will charge Acheron's ultimate. So essentially, Acheron's ultimate gauge is everyone's ultimate gauge. Said ultimate is a bedrock of her kit, dealing without question the highest damage in a single cast of any ability in the game across all targets. Considering it's an AoE ability, this makes her naturally effective against groups of enemies, but it's just as effective against a single enemy too. Most AoE attacks are generally not as efficient when attacking just 1 or 2 enemies given their lower base damage. Acheron's ultimate is more of an AoE blast attack, dealing increased damage to the main target, but in contrast to blast attacks only dealing around half damage to adjacent enemies, Acheron's is more like 80%. She pretty much deals full damage whether you're fighting 1 or 5 dudes. Plus the scaling on this ability is so high that 9 times out of 10 it's beyond overkill. Rainblade increases in damage by up to 60% based on the number of Crimson Knot stacks on the target, which are responsible for maximizing her ult's damage. Furthermore, her A4 trace magnifies the total damage output by an additional 1.15 or 1.6 times depending on the number of additional Nihility characters on your team. And then her A6 trace gives her even more damage when using her ultimate, to the tune of 90%. Altogether, it would be no exaggeration to say that Acheron's ultimate can deal thrice the damage of other characters' most powerful attacks in a single blow. One of her major traces gives her more damage augmentation than all 3 of another character's traces. If that wasn't enough, Acheron's ultimate deals partial true damage to enemies, as it will always have 20% rest penetration when being casted. And on top of that, it breaks toughness gauges even against enemies that don't have lightning vulnerability. This attack just destroys everything in the most literal sense of the word. Weaker enemies will be lucky to survive even one of its 5 attacks, and the extraordinary scaling on this attack is high enough to one-shot bosses with enough setup. Whoever wrote Acheron's review section in Pridewind made a very apt description of her kill power. Do you know why they say lightning rarely strikes twice? It's because she usually doesn't have to. Couldn't have said it better myself. In essence, Acheron can pull a Genshin Impact and ignore Cycle Blessings or enemy types by tearing through MOC and Pure Fiction through brute force alone. Another shining virtue of her repertoire is how surprisingly consistent and easy she is to play. I already talked about how easily you can charge up her ultimate despite having an alternate activation requirement, but in regards to maximizing her damage, she is very forgiving. To reach her full output, you need as many Crimson Knot stacks as possible on the enemy team, but there's a chance of Crimson Knot being spread out when ideally they should be all condensed onto your main target. Fortunately, during her ultimate cast, you can change your target to whichever enemy is holding leftover Crimson Knot, and at the end of the attack, it tabulates all the total stacks removed when dealing the final damage. Basically, as long as at the end you remove the total of 9 Crimson Knot stacks across all enemies you're hitting, you successfully maxed out her burst. Doesn't really matter all that much if all 9 are on one person or if they're split between 2 enemies. The funny thing is, you almost never have to worry about if you're maximizing her ult damage because, like I said, most of the time it's so overkill you can just Oonga Boonga and kill everything anyway. Or when in doubt, her auto battle AI will properly target enemies for you. Honestly, Acheron's one of the most idiot-proof characters in the game, further highlighting why so many people like to play her. Anecdotally, I always just bring Acheron for one party because she just works. Her kit is so universal and overpowered that with enough investment, she just clears, and it becomes even more brain dead if you give her the right stuff. Her second Eidolon not only gives her a point of ultimate charge at the start of every turn, but the number of Nihility teammates you need in her party lower from 2 to 1, freeing up a slot for a wide range of new supports to bring. Then her personal light cone offers no less than 3 damage boosters to her, and it causes her attacks to apply a debuff on hit, which as you know, is another charge for her ultimate. Combine that with the fact that you can now bring a turn advancer like Sparkle thanks to only needing either Pela or Silver Wolf to max out her A4, and she can realistically pull off her ultimate once per turn cycle. Not a single unit up until that point could come anywhere close to what Acheron was capable of, certainly not in all 3 game modes. Additionally, though her 2 Nihility requirement at E0 may appear to hamstring her party choices, it actually works in her favor more often than not. Firstly, it's in your best interest to bring Nihility characters anyway, seeing as how she depends on debuffs for her ultimate, so even if you have E2 Acheron, there's no harm in bringing 2 Nihility units anyway. It also affords her a bit of creative latitude. Though it's not optimal, Acheron can squeeze into a Kafka Swan team, fulfilling her Nihility requirements, while the 2 lovely ladies can juice up her ultimate with their respective dots, making it the first ever rendition of a triple carry team comp. Sustain units with a modicum of debuffing can further contribute towards her damage as well. Aventurin's follow-up attack when equipping a signature light cone, as well as the debuff on his ultimate, or you can run Gallagher courtesy of his own debuff. Theoretically, anyone who can apply a debuff can work with Acheron to some extent. This also means Acheron doesn't have to compete with other parties for high demand supports. Robin, Ranmei, Huohuo, Tingyun, Bronya, you can save all of those for the other party. She does use Sparkle, especially with E2, but like I said, if you really need Sparkle for say Lunai Danheng or Jinyuan on the other side, then by all means you can still run 2 Nihility for Acheron. So not only is she an outstanding DPS character, but she also doesn't eat off the same plate of other teams all that much. Now technically, while she can use a wide range of units for her team, she's still fairly expensive to build if you really want to go the distance on her. But if you do have the desire to vertical invest in someone, then going E2 S1 and Acheron and grabbing 5-star supports solely for her will take you much further than just about anyone else besides maybe Firefly. And the best part is that she still has plenty of room to grow. Though Pela is a fantastic support, she's a 4-star character and therefore liable to get power crept. However, as you know, Jiaotou is coming very soon. If not by the time you see this, he may already be out, and he's a Nihility 5-star. Think about that for a moment. This isn't even the farthest Acheron can go. By all accounts, Silverwolf and Pela are not even catered towards our playstyle, and moreover, we still don't have a sustain option for Nihility. If we get a support with bonus ultimate damage or more specialized Nihility characters, Acheron can get even stronger. Convenience is also another aspect of her that I think deserves mention. Acheron's one of the most comfy characters to use in a general setting thanks to her technique. Assuming you can replenish her technique points, she can insta-kill enemies in the overworld or Simuni without having to enter battle, and if on the off chance you do enter battle, she'll likely one-shot them with the technique alone. It makes creating a weekly save file for Divergent Universe a breeze, and it also aids in her pure fiction clears by blitzing the first squad of each wave. On that note, Acheron was the first character whose technique repeatedly triggered every wave. Prior to Firefly, every other first strike technique like Silver Wolf or Lunite Dan Hunks would only apply to the first wave. Even to this day, it's one of the most convenient time savers. Although I'm just saying, no one beats Firefly in the Warp Trotter minigame or Jingleo in the Barrel minigame. Final reason behind everyone playing her is that it's become abundantly clear Hoyo is 100% biased towards Acheron. Have you guys noticed, virtually every MLC and Pure Fiction cycle that came out since Acheron's release just so happens to include enemies of the lightning weakness and or memory turbulence inherently favoring her in some capacity? I don't know if it's because Acheron herself is so all-covering that she can take advantage of even the slightest inch given to her, but I swear, in every Pure Fiction from 2.1 onwards, one of those bosses you can choose always comes in the form of bonus ultimate damage or things of that nature. Acheron doesn't even need the extra stuff, but they end up giving it to her anyway. The current Pure Fiction iteration isn't even lightning oriented, but you can choose a chicanery buff and one-shot everyone. When Apocalyptic Shadow first came out, they made it very break focused to promote Firefly and Boothill, but they made Cocolia weak to lightning and made one of the buffs bonus 50% ultimate damage, which obviously was intended for Acheron. Not to mention, most bosses in this game endlessly spawn 2 or 4 enemies to fight alongside them, which might be cumbersome for other DPS units, but it's no skin off Acheron's back. Literally every cycle of all 3 game modes has either implicitly favored Acheron by giving us a bunch of lightning weak enemies, or overtly favored Acheron by having an ultimate damage buff. It's no surprise why she's always like top 5 if not top 3 most played characters in the game. She's broken, and they've been constantly putting us in situations that practically scream use Acheron. Not a bad thing, mind you, most of us were going to anyway, but it's annoyingly funny how much they want us to use her when they made it so egregiously clear that Acheron beats everything in the game without trying. Really, there's only one character who comes close in strength to her right now, and that's Firefly with the help of Ranmei and Harmony Trailblazer. But even though Firefly's team potentially outdamages Acheron's team turn for turn in the right circumstances, break teams are inherently situational and prone to getting shut down by anyone who can lock toughness gauges. Acheron, on the other hand, has no real vulnerability whatsoever, at least not one that disproportionately affects her more than everyone else. She has tons of raw damage, she can attack one enemy or attack multiple enemies at maximum efficiency, she does partial true damage, and can shred enemy toughness gauges even if they're not vulnerable to lightning. She doesn't suffer from any inconsistency issues that other characters might, such as Black Swan not being able to stack Arcana fast enough or Genuine getting crowd controlled, nor is she that resource intensive in regards to SP costs like Bronya and Lunite Dan Hung. If I had to nitpick one problem with her, it would be the aforementioned price tag on her. Not to say you can't use her at E0 without her signature weapon, but Acheron at E2S1 is just a totally different beast of a character. See, that's the thing, I'm grasping at straws trying to figure out a con for her. There is none. They were determined to make her as ridiculously overpowered as possible, whether it's because she's a popular character in the greater Honkai fandom, being an alternate Raiden Mei, or if they're basing it on lore, in which case Acheron is far and away the strongest character we've seen up until this point. But it was inconceivable how far ahead she pushed the ceiling of the game, and she still has room for more improvement. Bottom line, if any new player were to ask me who's a good DPS to invest in, I would say mark your calendars the second they announce an Acheron rerun, and no one would disagree. Hands down one of the best attackers in the entire game, and will no doubt continue to stay that way. Anyways, I think that's enough glazing for today. TLDR, everyone plays Acheron cause she's horseshit. If you guys enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFerm, join my Discord server, and why not check out my Why Everyone Plays Ranmei if you haven't yet. I think in light of recent times, that video has aged pretty well. Till next time though, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.